So scenario planning, 3 steps. Step number 1 is where do you go through and get the data from to go through and think about the future. Step number 2 is about understanding your business. Step number 3 is the consequence of what you find when you look at the data of the future and how that can go through and alter the industry, and then what contingencies do you have to go through and put into place for that. So we're going to start off today with the trend analysis. This is step number 1. So what do we mean by trend? A definition of a macro trend. This is where you can see a clear shift in the direction of something that happens around the world in society. It could be in industry, it could be in politics, it could be in climate, right? But this is a clear shift in direction. And it's characterized by something which is long-term. It's not a short-term fad. It's got a long-term impact, okay? So this is what a trend is. And we see it around us all the time. This is absolutely crucial to the scenario planning process. It's the most important part because it gives a hint about the way that things are changing in the world. It can actually help decode the behavior of society, which is notoriously unpredictable. It helps us with anticipating change. And we can't actually develop weak signals properly without knowing where to go to for data. And the macro trend is the data. And The Economist said a couple of years ago that all of these things, all of these shifts, all these trends are changing, and it's highlighted through rising inequality, unemployment, the perception of politicians failing, institutional failure. Companies are failing because they're misreading these trends. Okay? So it's a very important part to scenario planning process. 2 more reasons. Number 1 is that engaging with trends allows you to go through and improve your decision making because you're getting more information to be able to go through and assess what's going on in the future. Okay? Number 2, the more you do this, the more you pick up on very clear signs that some people might regard as being unexpected. Because you've gone through and accumulated so much data in this area, you're 1 step ahead of other people as well. Where do you go through and get macro trend data from? Well, this particular slide shows many examples of where you can go through and pick up on macro trend data. Some of them are specific books which are produced every year that highlight macro trend data. Some of them are produced every single week. So for example, right in the middle of the screen, you have an example from The Economist that regularly goes through and highlights macro trend changes. A really good article to go through and read every single week from The Economist relating to this. So to give you some examples of trend predictions, right? So they're always future looking. Number 1, many of these are related to demographics. By 2050, the amount of 100-year-olds in the world is expected to rise 8-fold from 2020 until 2050. This is one example. Second example relates to the accumulation of wealth in society. So this is called, where are the middle class? These are the ones that really go through and generate economic growth in countries. And the graph you can go through and see here shows that in most regions of the world, middle class growth is increasing up until 2048. Really important metric for companies to go through and understand if they want to expand. Third example, urbanizations, people living in cities. From 1900s, it was 2 out of every 10 people who were living in an urban area. By 2050, it's projected to be 7 out of 10. This is a very clear example of a macro trend projection. One more example is about the percentage of the workforce, work age people in the workforce up until 2030. And in some parts of the world, that number is decreasing, causing big issues within society. So within Japan, within Italy, within Hungary, within Thailand itself, the pressure on the workplace because of the lack of people who are going into that and the consequences that might have on things like the need for immigration, for migrants, or for the need to have more automation in the workplace. This is a very, very good example of a macro trend going forward to 2030. Other examples in demographics. This is about population growth and the expected population by the end of this century. The figure that you've got in purple here is actually related to Africa. And the African population is expected to be rivaling Asia by the end of the century. Okay? Asian population will start to go through and dip around 2045, 2050. All of the other continents are stagnating or reducing the amount of people in those continents. The impact on the global economy in 50, 60 years' time is likely to be that Africa will be where the people with money will be. The same rise that you've seen across Asia, China, Korea, the tiger economies, is likely to be seen in 10 or 12 African countries that have all got big population increases, combined with very, very good levels of education increase. So literacy rates are improving. The amounts of money that those middle class in Africa will be getting is going to be a game changer for business in the next 20, 30, 40 years. Okay? So all of these trends have got one thing in common. They're all projecting about what may well happen and are likely to happen in the future. The weak signal is related to, it still shocks people. Still shocks people that some of these things could happen, even though they're fairly predictable. And the last one on here is related to a change in transportation. Right? In the last 150 years, there's been really 3 or 4 shifts in the way that we go through and transport. From horse-drawn carts, canals, railways, motor vehicles, aeroplanes. We're now on the cusp of other forms of transportation, and the changes to the planet will be immense. One of those already in operation are taxi drones, taking people from A to B. Living in somewhere like Bangkok, you can imagine that trying to escape a 2 or 3 hour traffic jam, and you know you can go through and jump into a drone taxi, and it'll take you 5 minutes rather than 3 hours to get from A to B. This is one of the reasons why this particular diagram is showing such a dramatic increase in the volume of people using drones as a kind of mean of transportation, mass transformation. Okay, and then other places where you can go through and get a hint of trend data. This is within headlines. Returning again to The Economist, in 2018, there's been a projection about the amount of quantum computers that are being produced, and even supercomputers, which again will completely revolutionize the way that we go through and interact. Another example here is from a different particular magazine, but projecting the way that the amount of planes, despite all of the economic and other situations which are taking place at the moment, that planes are likely to go through and double in the next 20 years as well. Okay. One other example of trend data is the way that people are turning from eating meat to either being flexitarians or being vegetarians, and the impact this has on the milk meat market. Okay, and this was an article from 18 months ago. Other things, talking about the increase in science that can go through and project things like a simple blood test is likely in the future to reveal your own life expectancy. This is something that's just really quite scary, but you can imagine how this can be used by governments, by businesses, and it will really alter the way that we go through and lead our lives. So all of these things have the potential to be quite, some of them are fairly predictable trends. This one itself is relatively unpredictable, but each one of them have got the potential to go through and completely change, not just the way the business does their own, the regular business model, but the way we lead our lives as well. Okay. One other one that I've been familiar with for the last 5 or 6 years is the way that certain materials are now being produced which are likely to go through and replace things like plastic. One of those is called graphene, was produced by the University of Manchester going back about 7 or 8 years. This is a material which is very lightweight, very durable, very sustainable, and is starting to go through and develop traction. So we're likely to go through and see that in many of the things that we actually have in front of us now. This material, which you might have not have heard of, but it's been around for 8, 9 years and is slowly changing our staple ways of going through and actually having materials to make things. So, provided you with a definition of trends, giving you some example of trend data, you get predictable trends and you get unpredictable trends, depending on the different type of category. So predictable trends are usually things like demographics, the way that the world is increasing its population. They're fairly predictable. Things like there will be a pandemic once every 25 or 30 years is also fairly predictable when you look at human history. And that's obviously something that we're going through as this is being filmed. Then you get unpredictable events. So unpredictable events are around things like politics, climate change, also about consumer behavior. These things are really quite difficult to go through and project or predict. Even technology, the fast pace of technology is actually quite difficult to predict when it's going to impact society. So we go back to different types of uncertainties. You have path uncertainty, destination uncertainty, and things which are completely outside the box. This is similar to that you can look at different trends and they're either predictable or less predictable. And this is important as we grow our scenarios. Okay, so what I'm going to point out to you now is a link to the KPMG document called Future State 2030. If you go through and click on that link, or you click on the Roland Berger Trend Compendium link 2030, both of these show different types of trends. What I want you to go through and start looking through is going to be, what might you consider to be more predictable and unpredictable? So that's the first thing. Okay? The second thing within this exercise is to realize that things like demography are very, very predictable, that it's very easy to go through and misclassify something which is predictable or unpredictable, but I want you to go through and try to attempt that. So this exercise, exercise 2.4, is to go through and view the video, look at the documents that I gave you on the previous slides, maybe go through and do a Google search, and work out which trends do you think are predictable and unpredictable. And that is exercise 2.4. The link itself is 4 minutes long and is provided in this particular web link.